What if death wasn't the villain? Not in the way we have been taught to imagine it. Not a monster, not a punishment, not a shadow waiting to steal what we love, but something older, quieter, more patient. Something that has stood at the edge of every room where a life changed form. Something that has heard the final breaths, the unfinished sentences, the last apologies, the names whispered when no one else was close enough to listen. What if death remembers? That is the question at the heart of stories death keeps, because in this story, death does not simply take. Death witnesses. Death waits. Death remembers the people the living world reduces to outcomes. The patient who did not survive. The child whose chart became a closed record. The mother whose hand went cold before anyone knew what else to say. The stranger who died under fluorescent lights while someone tried very hard to bring them back. The ones who were loved. The ones who were forgotten. The ones whose stories ended before anyone understood what they meant. And maybe that is why death feels so terrifying. Not only because it ends a life, but because it knows everything we could not save, everything we did not say, everything we wish we could go back and hold differently. For Mara, that question is not philosophical. It is personal. She is an emergency physician. Her whole life is built around the impossible hope of keeping death out of the room. She knows the body is a system, a rhythm, a set of numbers, a crisis to be managed, a pulse to be found, a breath to be restored. But Mara also knows something most physicians are trained not to say out loud. Sometimes the body does not come back. Sometimes the room changes. Sometimes everyone keeps working long after some part of them already knows. And sometimes death is there before anyone calls it by name. Mara has seen death before, as a child, as a young woman, as someone who should not still be alive. But when she loses a child patient she cannot save, something inside her fractures open. Not because the child creates the haunting, because the child reopens it. And death returns, not to threaten her, not to punish her, not to drag her into darkness, but to remind her of what she has spent her life trying not to know, that death is not always the enemy. Sometimes death is the only witness left, the only presence that stayed until the very end, the only keeper of the story after everyone else walked out of the room because they had to keep living. That does not make death gentle. It does not make loss beautiful. It does not make grief easier to carry. But it changes the question. Instead of asking, why did death take them? Maybe we begin to ask, what did death remember? What did it see in the final moment? What story did it hold when the living could not? What tenderness remained when the machines went quiet? What truth survived the ending? In Stories Death Keeps, Mara is forced to confront the one thing she cannot chart, code, diagnose, or control. The dead are not outcomes. They are not failures. They are not statistics. They are stories, and someone has been keeping them. That is what makes this story dark. Not because death is cruel, but because death remembers too much. And that is what makes it beautiful, because to be remembered is not the same as being saved, but it is not nothing. It means your breath mattered, your pain mattered, your name mattered. Your life touched the world and left evidence behind. Maybe death is frightening because it is final, but maybe death is sacred because it is the last witness to who we were. Stories Death Keeps arrives June 2026, a dark, intimate novel about grief, survival, and the stories death refuses to forget. What if death wasn't the villain? What if death was the one who remembered?